Well, this morning, as we just listened to the gospel passage, we are continuing on, verse for verse, from the story that continues from last week. We're still in the same circumstance, right? So let's all walk back about 7 days. If you'll remember from last weekend, Jesus goes to the synagogue at Nazareth, his hometown, kind of at the beginning of his ministry, and he's not a rabbi. He's not officially trained, but people know the dude to be kind of a big deal because they've heard some things about him. People he's been healing, prophetic words he's been giving. He's clearly somebody different than they're used to. And so when he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, the rabbi of that synagogue allows him to speak. And he is given a scroll from the prophet Isaiah. And when he reads the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, what Jesus reads is a direct set of verses that are a prophecy about the Messiah. I'll read them to you again, just so that we can remember what Jesus said. Let me get to the page from a week ago. Jesus read these words: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord." So Jesus has just read from this scripture passage, and he's commenting on it upon it now. And what Jesus has just told everybody is that as you hear these words, this scripture passage is fulfilled. Now that's a very significant, amazing thing for Jesus to say, because everybody in that synagogue is very well aware of those well-known popular verses from the prophet Isaiah, because they know that those verses are speaking about the Messiah. The Messiah is going to be the one who comes to save the nation of Israel. It's a big deal. And Jesus said, "You heard these words, and I tell you, these words are fulfilled." Connect the dots, he says, in effect. Jesus has just told everybody in the synagogue he's the Messiah. He's just told everyone, I am the one prophesied here. I am the one who's coming. I am the one who's going to save the nation. And this is what they felt about it, right? They were like, no. No, they were all amazed. They were amazed at what Jesus said, because clearly this man is capable of eloquent, gracious words. And then they say something interesting, right? And so I kind of want to explain this altercation that ensues, because they ask themselves, isn't this the son of Joseph? The reason that they say this is because Jesus has just made the claim to be the Messiah. So immediately what enters their minds is, okay, what's the Messiah going to be like? How are we going to know the Messiah is here? And when they look at Jesus, they say, isn't this the son of Joseph? They say, we have known him because he's been living here for at least 2.5 decades. He's the son of a carpenter. And in their minds, they know the Messiah is not going to be a carpenter. The Messiah is not going to be a carpenter. The Messiah is going to be like all of our leaders of old. He's going to be like King David. We know the Messiah is going to be like a warrior who's going to save the nation. The Messiah is going to walk in the footsteps of Moses, the greatest of all the prophets, who in the Psalms was also called a priest of God. They had all of these conceptions about who the Messiah was going to be, and Jesus did not fit the bill, even though he's just made the claim. And so Jesus, who knows that this is in their hearts, then quotes to them one of their own proverbs of the day. And he says, surely you will give to me this proverb, physician, cure yourself. And you'll ask me to do here in your native place the things that you've heard that I've done in Capernaum. Physician, cure yourself. What does that mean? Think about it this way. How many of you here have ever walked into a dentist's office and seen a dentist with crooked, yellow, decaying teeth in his mouth? Anybody? Have you ever seen a dentist with bad teeth? I have never. I have never seen that happen. Because if you were to see a dentist with super horrible teeth, would you trust him as a dentist? Probably not. It really wouldn't be good for business. None of you have probably ever had a doctor or primary care physician who, on the regular, walked in to see his patients and was like hacking up half of his lung whilst he was doing his examination on them. That probably wouldn't be good for business because he's the physician. Why would he be a physician if he can't be curing himself, if he can't be well? None of us has ever seen a car mechanic driving around with a half-working clunker rusted out. They probably have a kind of a nice car, right? So this is what they're saying to Jesus: physician, cure thyself. In other words, look at yourself, man. Look at yourself. You've just said that you're Messiah, but we know who you are. You need to prove to us you're the Messiah, right? Surely you will ask me to do here what you heard that I did in Capernaum, things that only the Messiah can do. They're calling Jesus out. They're saying, look at your own life. You're just a podunk carpenter, man. You're not the Messiah. Jesus knows this, and he returns this to them. And Jesus says, amen, I say to you, here's what happened in history. He gives two of these interesting instances in the history of Israel about the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha. And in these instances, in the life of the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha, they go and find themselves ministering to not the people of Israel, but the pagan. Elijah goes and ministers to a widow in the land of Sidon, pagan territory. And Elisha the prophet cleanses Naaman the Syrian, Syria, pagan territory. Why do the prophets go to the pagans in the time of Elisha, in the time of Elijah? Because God's own people don't know him. God's own people have hearts that are closed to him. So God sends his prophet to those whose hearts will be open to him instead. Jesus is actually calling them out. Jesus says, you want to know what's frustrating about this situation? You've lived with me for 2.5 decades, and you don't know me. How do you not know me? They are unable to recognize the true identity of Jesus. And Jesus says, when he references these two instances in the prophets, he says, it's not because I've been dishonest, it's because you've been unfaithful. And since you've been unfaithful, God can't come to you. You can't see God. God can't minister to you in the way that you would want him to. The ancient people of Israel lacked faith, and so there were what? There were famines, there was disease. God couldn't bless them because their own hearts were closed. And what Jesus is going through here is like a very common and difficult experience that we just have as humans. One of the greatest pains I think that we have as people is when we feel like we're misunderstood. If you live long enough, you will have the opportunity to feel misunderstood. And why is that so painful for us? Have you ever had a situation, an acquaintance, maybe even a friend or a deep relationship where there's so much frustration built over time, you get to a point where you're just like, how do you not know me? Or if you feel so misunderstood, why is it so frustrating? Because it's like, there's just nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do to make myself understood. I feel like I've been so honest and forthright, but like, why don't you see me for who I am? That's a really horrible experience to have in life, but if you live long enough, you're gonna have it. We've all probably had it if we're old enough. That's a hard place to be. And we also know the flip side as well, and what difference that kind of makes. The places of relationships that are broken can really teach us difficult things. Most of the time when we go through the feeling of being misunderstood or a relationship that breaks down because one person doesn't know the other, what's the aftermath of that? What do you learn from that? What do we learn to do? whether we know it or not, probably what we learn to do from that circumstance is we learn to hide ourselves, we learn to insulate ourselves, we learn to have our guard up because we just don't want to go through that kind of pain. It's very real. And so we become cautious after that, don't we? Whenever we feel like we're misunderstood, when people don't know us for who we truly are. But on the other hand, when the opposite thing happens, it is totally transformative to us. Think about those other relationships maybe that you've had in your life that we've been through where we've made that decision to be vulnerable with each other and we've truly come to understand the other person as they are in reality. And in that kind of, the freedom of that kind of relationships, what blessings come from that, because you can just look to that person and you're just like, oh, you know me. How does it feel? How does it feel, that experience, when you say to yourself, you know me? How does it feel to feel like you've really been seen and understood? It's the most incredible feeling. We are so deeply, just instinctively desirous for it. And it's so instinctively difficult when that doesn't happen. And that's all the things that are going on here. And here's what's so important and revelatory about this when it happens in the life of Jesus. Because Jesus has to do this really difficult thing and point out a brokenness in the hearts of his own people. Because they don't know the truth about themselves. They're living in their own set of false expectations. And he has to bring that to the surface. And when that's brought to the surface, it's very sensitive, right? It's like touching an open wound. It hurts very, very badly. And so they go from amazement to rage. It escalates very, very, very quickly. It would be like, after preaching, you storm the sanctuary, pick me up by my hands and feet, and throw me on the street to be run over by a car. I mean, that's just kind of extreme, isn't it? But they're literally trying to enrage, they're trying to kill the man. And so Jesus is really revealing how important it is for us to be known, to know ourselves truly, to know each other truly, and most especially to understand God. When God is misunderstood, what happens? Death. They just didn't understand Jesus. They didn't understand God. And so what was the reaction? Death. They wanted to kill. Rage. It wasn't healing. It was, no, here's the truth of the brokenness, and here's what brokenness does when it's not related to God and redeemed by him. I mean, this was so obvious and so important that you didn't even have to be Jewish or even Christian. This was long known as part of the wisdom of humanity, the ancient temple of Delphi, right? Right across the entrance to that temple was the famous proverb, know thyself. Know thyself. This was even in the pagan proverbs, the pagan wisdom. Because if people grow up and don't know who they are, and don't know who God is, nothing good can happen. Nothing good can happen. But when people experience themselves to be seen truly, to be known truly, and to see someone else truly, and to know someone else truly, the freedom and the blessing of that kind of relationship is salvific. It's salvific. It literally saves people. It saves lives. That's how important this experience is. That's why I think one of the reasons why it was written down, why was it remembered? Why is it given to us in the scriptures now? Because Jesus knows the same thing that we know, that in life, we see this and we see this, and we know just how very different they are. You know, this week, out to Lumen and all around our Catholic parishes, we have Catholic Schools Week, right? We take this moment, this week each year to celebrate the importance of what goes on in that context. Why do we do that? Why is part of the mission of the church to educate our sons and our daughters? because of this story, because of the story of the revelation of how important it is to know truly who God is, and to know thyself truly as we are, and to know each other truly as they are. God revealed it right in the first reading, that prophet Jeremiah, the opening lines to that whole book, when God says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born into time, I knew you from all eternity. I've known you forever, God says. I've known you forever. Before you were born, I consecrated you. Before you even had a chance to breathe the open air, I had already set you aside for my purposes and placed a mission before you in your life, knowing who you are and what you've been made for. God says, I know this. And the revelation of the story of Jesus here at Nazareth is this, that we can't actually fully know ourselves unless God reveals it to us. We can't know the full truth of ourselves. We can't know the full truth of each other. We can't even know the full truth of God unless God breaks through in all of those places, to anoint those places, to bless those places, to redeem and to save those places. Because if he doesn't, it is the difference between life and death. It's like it's that real, right? And so as we, even as a church, right, receiving Jesus as the Messiah, who is the Christ, when we follow him, we are called Christians, which means that the mission of the Christ becomes the mission of the Christian. And the mission of the Christian is the same fulfillment of the prophecy there in Isaiah. To bring good tidings to the poor, to set free those who are captive, to give relief to those who are oppressed, to bring sight to those who are blind. And this is so important, this is so integral to our mission as a church, that we need our sons and our daughters to grow up knowing who they are, knowing what they've been made for, knowing who God is. This is why we give so much time and energy and a resource to something like a school where we can form our kids in the fullness of the truth. Why? Because you don't want your kids to die. I mean, that's a blunt way to say it, but that's the gospel way of putting it. You want your sons and your daughters to live, and so do I. And the only way that we come to the fullness of that life is through the revelation of God's grace that comes, that breaks through to us. Because if we don't have that revelation from Christ, we get the lies of all the world. And you know, I don't need to talk to you about that. We all know what that is. We read it in the paper every day. It's really cumbersome to have to continue to live, right, with those kinds of things and that kind of frustration in the world. Salvation is not to be found there, but where is it to be found? In love. Love is what opens that door. The love of God is what opens the door to you knowing who you are. Love is what opens the door to knowing who God is. Love, in the end, is the greatest thing that will ever remain. God says that out of his own mouth through the words of his apostle Paul. And love is the key. Love is the key to what breaks through people's brokenness so that they can know the truth of who God is and the truth of who they are. That kind of love blesses, that kind of love transforms. That's the kind of love that we yearn for, that we were made for, that we need lest we die. And it's the very love that God has come to give here right now.